started. Okay. Okay, so let's see the Gemara. Hatruma. What do they do with the money? All the money that came in, what do they do with it? Mahoy Oishaba. What do they do with it? Zogt the Helig Mishnah. Like Chimba. They would buy with it to meet them, the carbon tuments, which were communal. Umusafin, the carbon Moses. In this came the carbon Minche, the wine that accompanied them. Ha'omer, Ushtelachem. So the Omer was brought on Pesach, the Shekalim was brought on Shavuos, the Lechem upon them, which was brought weekly, the Chol Karbonis Hatzibor, and all the communal Karbonis. Shomrei Svichin B'Shvius. Now, they needed to have wheat that belonged to the Beis HaMikdash to bring as a communal carbon to bring the Omer. Now, on Shemitah, you weren't allowed to plant anything. So what they had to do is they had to identify wild growing wheat so that they'll have wheat to the carbon Omer. Now, they needed someone to watch it because otherwise anybody could take it and then basically wouldn't have it. So they actually paid watchmen to guard over some of the wheat. Now, the obvious problem is you're not allowed to treat it like it's personal. You're not allowed to take shvius. You're only allowed it has to remain hefker. So how can you guard it? So there's a whole bunch of different approaches to explain this. But one simple approach is the guard wasn't disallowing anybody to take. He was just there to notify people. This is hefker, and you have every right to take it. But the Beis HaMikdash is going to need it for the carbon Omer. So you might want to be aware of that, because if you are, morning Duffy, if you are, then maybe you won't take it. So that's one of the pshatim that they have as to how they're allowed to set up a shomer for the shvius, for the wild wheat. Now we have to pay them. The question is, who pays them? Zogt the head of the Mishnah, Neutlin Schorin Trumas Halishka.
Just a second. Isn't there supposed to be a bracha that the Rebbeinu Shalom is going to provide so much wheat from the year before? Rebbeinu Shalom is going to have a bracha.
Yeah, but the problem is that's for personal use. But the carbon Omer had to have been brought from wheat that grew that year.
Uh-huh.
So there might be plenty food to eat out there, but we needed something that was specifically grown now, which has to be hefker. Yet we still needed to make sure we have some for the carbon Omer. So Rabbi Omer. So they took the money from Trumas Halishka. Now the Gemara is going to discuss a little bit of a problem, is because when it comes to hektish items, you could never just discharge the kedusha from hektish money. It must always be transferred to another object. So how do you pay for labor if there's not going to be any object on which to transfer the kedusha? So that's going to be something that the Gemara is going to have to deal with. Yosy Omer, Af haroitza misnabit shemechina. You could be a volunteer. Who said you have to be paid at all? The problem with that is if you're a shemechinam, so then now the wheat that you've watched sort of became personal. You were sort of coined with the fact that you watched it. So when you turn it over to the tzibur, it's not going to be communal. And this is what Rabbi Yosy holds. Rabbi Yosy holds that no, just because it starts off personal, who said when I turn it over to the tzibur, it will not become communal?
How's the shomer sucker any better?
I'm sorry? Because if we're paying you to watch it, and we'll look at the takman inside, if we're paying you to watch it, so you're watching it for us. So we take ownership of it. It's like if you're working for IBM and you develop Windows, so IBM owns the patent. You can't just claim the patent on your own.
Wrong company.
No, it's not the wrong company. There's been a lawsuit for years.
Oh.
IBM claims that Bill Gates invented Windows while he was working for them. And he always claimed that he thought of it the day after he left. And IBM was never able to prove in court that
Apple has the same
that
claim about Word.
I'm sorry.
Apple had the same claim about Word,
Aha,
Microsoft Word.
that's the way it always goes. Yeah. Amrulai, Af Ata Omer. You're going to also say Shein Boyin Ella. Shein Boyin Ella Mishal Tzibur. You also said that could only come from the tzibur. So let's see the takbin on this prat. Afata, but actually we should go back over. Shem chinam, the af shekana oisam in a hefker kisheshamram chinam. Even though when you watch them for free, you were konya them from hefker. Nevertheless, savar the korban yochid mishtanel shel tzibur. Yosy holds that a korban of a yochid, meaning this wheat, belongs to the person who watched it. He could now transfer it over to the tzibur and becomes tzibur. So the Chachamim responded, Avat Kleiner, I ata moida, the boin mishal tzibur. Don't you agree that it has to be brought only from communal funds? The shomar chinam, and if you watch them for free, zocha b'hem, you yourself, the yochid was zoicha in this week. Nimtza she'enim bad mishal tzibur. So now the wheat that's going to be brought as the korban omer is no longer a communal korban. The spherele, because the Rabbanan hold the ein korban yochid mishtanel shel tzibur. U'lishitasam hashivu. So the Rabbanan, with their position, told Rabbi Yosy, what you're suggesting is impossible, because once it starts off as a personal item, it can't be magically transferred to a communal item. And therefore, you cannot use a shomer chinam, it must be a shomer sachar. Okay, so let's see what the hell Gemara says. So there's the Mishnah, I believe it's in Tainus. Let's look at the Aleph. It's Tainus, Perek Dal to Luchadal, Megillah Perek Kama Luchadal. Okay, so it's in Tainus. It says that there are 9 times in the year where there was a Yom Tov. And the Yom Tov was based on the fact it wasn't a Yom Tov for everybody. It was a Yom Tov for 9 different families. Each family had a Yom Tov on a specific day, and the Yom Tov celebrated the following. So to Heilige Gemara. The Gra once again changes the gears a little bit. It doesn't have a huge impact, but I'm trying to follow the Gra. Taman Taninon. We learned Zman Atze Kahanim Ve'am Lihimanis. So the question is, the Gemara wants to know, is what's the reason for this Yom Tov? Why was there a Yom Tov on these 9 days? Ella, B'shasha Olul Yisrael min HaGoyla. When Klal Yisrael came up from Golus Rishon to build the second Beis HaMikdash, V'lei matzu eitzim b'lishka, and unfortunately, the Beis HaMikdash didn't have wood, so they couldn't burn their karbanos. So they needed volunteers. They needed people who would bring wood. V'amdu elu, these 9 families took the initiative. Nisnadvu eitzim mishal atzman, and they donated wood that they owned. It must have been very valuable if it was scarce. And they gave over their personal wood to the tzibur. The kavu man karbanis tzibur, and they were makriv from the wood that they donated carbon tzibur. So at that point, they got a schus to be able to supply wood. The hisnu imayim nevim shebenem. The nevim amongst them made a t'nai. Shafilu lishka meleya eitzim. Even if wood is plentiful and the Beis HaMikdash has more than enough wood, but v'amdu el in this nadvu eitzim mishal atzmon. Nevertheless, these people provided their own wood. They donated wood to the Beis HaMikdash forever and ever. Shelo yehei carbon miskarv ela mishalahen tchila. Will always be makriv the carbon from the wood that they brought. So this seems to indicate that you could take personal wood and you can give it to the community, and it becomes communal. Amar Abacha, the Rabbi Yosy. This must go according to Rabbi Yosy in our Mishnah, who allowed a shomer chinam, because even though the wheat that you watched will be personal, when you turn it over to the Beis HaMikdash, it will become communal.
It's not the actual korban, it's the wood.
I'm sorry?
It's not the actual korban, it's the wood.
Oh, your mamish hitting home runs. That's exactly what the second sheet is going to argue. Beautiful. Omer Vacha, the Rabbi Yosy, because Rabbi Yosy Omer Afaroitza Misnadiv Shamachino. Rabbi Yosy says, so Rabbi Acha says, not like Duvi. Rabbi Acha says that the wood would pose a problem. But Rabbi Yosy,
Yosy,
yes.
Is Akiva Bolter on your line?
Not yet, but he usually joins in.
Okay.
By the way,
Okay,
regards
sorry
from Ashley. I'm davening with him every day.
Oh.
I'll tell him you send regards. I'll tell him you
Okay,
chimed in this morning because you wanted to say hi.
We're having trouble with our Zoom code. Okay.
What is which Zoom room are you supposed to be using?
5780.
And you're supposed to be using it right now?
It doesn't let us through.
Is it the password that's wrong?
We need a host. It says we're not, I don't know why. Each one of us who calls asks for a host. Okay, sorry about that. Okay. Keep going.
If you want, what you could do is you can all join here, and then I could transfer you in to a private room, and then you can continue. And then it'll just be a private room for your share.
You want to call into you?
If you all call into me, and then I could transfer all of you into a private room with Daniil.
Mm-hmm.
So if that works for you, I'm happy to do that.
It's with Baruch.
Baruch Reist is not on this line.
Yeah, I know. We tried this. I forgot that you're using it.
But you can still come here, and I'll just transfer you into a private room.
Mm-hmm.
So what about 1948?
1948. What about 603-550-1948?
Yeah, with the same 129129. Try that.
Okay, we'll try that. Okay, thank you
If it
very
doesn't
much.
come back here, I'll just transfer you into a room.
Okay, thanks. Sorry to bother you guys. Bye.
No, our pleasure. Okay. I thought Shoal was here to serve breakfast. I was getting all excited. Okay.
You have been his mano.
Okay, so let's see what the Gemara says. So Rabbi Acha wanted to suggest that since they were giving over wood, which was personal, to the Beis Hamikdash, that proves Rabbi Yosy Shita, that even though it started off as a carbon yachid, it could be transferred over to the rabbin. Rabbi Yosy said it's not a raya exactly because of Dovi Sora. Rabbi Yosy b'shem Rabbi Ila divrei koili. The story about giving over wood would be consistent even with the Rabbanan in our Mishnah. Ma pligin, exactly to the word that Dovi said. Ma pligin begufishal carbon. Where is there a problem of having something that comes from a yachid? That's the actual substance of the carbon. What are we discussing in the Mishnah? The actual wheat that you're going to be makriv on the mizbeach. Al b'machshira carbon. When you're just talking about wood, which is an accessory to process the carbon, but it's not the carbon itself. Called amamoidi. Everybody would agree, even the Rabbanan of our Mishnah, who does not allow the carbon of a yachid to be transferred to the rabbin, even he would agree, shehu mishtana carbon yachid la carbon tzibur. The wood, which is just an accessory to burn the carbon, even the chachamim in our Mishnah would agree that you could do that. I believe it's exactly what we said.
I seem to remember that wood is considered a carbon itself.
Wood could be brought
I can't remember
as an
the source
independent carbon as well. No, there is such a thing as a carbonated. Wood could be brought as a carbon itself. Indeed, it could, but I don't know if that's what it was being used here as well. Let's see what it says over here in the top, because I didn't notice that someone does mention that. But here, I believe that they were using the wood as an accessory. It wasn't a carbon itself. But I want to look at Takman. Here, Takman mentions exactly what they were saying. Michel Atzman, she a carbon nidvason. It will be a carbon itself. Kitan lakavan perkvov ha'omer harei alai eitzim. So there was something called carbonatum, but I still think over here they were bringing it as an accessory.
What do you mean as accessory? You need it. It's not an accessory, something extra. This is not extra. I don't know if you're using the right term exactly.
So
you
so
need
let me
eitzim
speak
for
more clearly.
For every carbon, you need eitzim.
Right. But besides that, there was actually something called a carbon eitzim, where there was nothing else brought. You brought the eitzim. And as a matter of fact, if you brought a carbon eitzim, you had to bring eitzim along with it to burn your carbon eitzim. So eitzim could be used as an accessory to a carbon to burn the mincha, to burn the behema, but there was an option to bring eitzim as a carbon in and of itself. But I don't think that's what we're discussing over here.
It's interesting. The lashon of the Gemara, Yosy, is v'karvu mehen korbanos tzibur, and they brought from it, from the wood.
Right. So are you saying it's mashra that the carbon was the wood itself?
No, it's mashra that at least the wood is part of the carbon.
So I hear, but clearly from the context of the Gemara, the Rabbi Yosy is making Dovi's distinction.
I completely agree with you.
Yeah. So let's see what the Talmud says over here. In the Gemara Bavli there, it brings the support from the pasuk in Nehemiah. Al carbon ha'etzim ha'kayhanim halavim ve'am lahavi lebeis alakenu. So they made a girl who should bring the wood. Lebeis avesenu leitim zumonim for specific days. Shana b'shana levar al mizbech Hashem alakenu ka'kosav v'torah. So I mean, it's masha. The wood itself was the carbon here. But when you talk about machshir carbon, it's eitzim lekarbanos. So I'm not sure what we're talking about specifically, but clearly Rabbi Yosy's explanation of what was going on here was that it was an accessory. It's possible that Rabbi Acha learned that it was actually a carbon eitzim, but Rabbi Yosy learns that it was definitely merely providing fire to burn the other karbanos, the meat karbanos or the wheat karbanos. And therefore, it's not a stira to the Shita Rabban who holds that the carbon itself has to remain communal. Tani, we learned a woman. Everyone is so proud. My son is a doctor. Everyone knows the famous story about the first Jewish president. And by the inauguration, the mother of the president is sitting there in the front. She turns to the person sitting there, and she points to the president and says, "You see that guy? His younger brother is a doctor," because they're so proud that the son's a doctor. So imagine if her son is the Kohen Gadol. So Tani Isha Sha'asasa Kisainis Levana. A woman was so proud of her son, who became the Kohen Gadol, that she made for him a Kisainis. She made him the Kisainis. So that means the Kisainis is not communal. The Kisainis is a personal device. So it's Kshera, Ubilvat Shetim Tzarena Latzibur. As long as after she makes this Kisainis, she gives it over, so that once again it's communal. So once again you have the same Shakra V'Taya. Amar Bacha, Rabbi Yosy. This must go according to Rabbi Yosy, because it's only Rabbi Yosy Omer that Af Haroitu Misnadav Shomer China. Rabbi Yosy B'Shem Abila said the same thing. Divra Koili. Ma Pligin B'Gufishal carbon. Machlokes says is if the carbon itself has to be of communal funds or if it could be of personal funds. Abu Machshira carbon. Now the beggar of the coin, everybody agrees, is for sure not a carbon itself. That's just something worn to make the avodah kosher. So Kali Mamoida, everybody would agree, Shehu Mishtana carbon Yochad carbon. There, even though his mother knitted it, and it was originally a personal device, a personal item, she could give it over to the tzibur, and therefore it's kosher for her son to wear. Okay, so let's see what it says. Masnisen pligi al Rabbi Yosy. Now this sugya, you could learn it one way or 180 degrees the other way. So even though the art scroll goes with this current girsa, but I'm trying to stick to the taklin to have a uniform shot. The art scroll goes back and forth from using the taklin to using the other mefarshim and I usually picks the simplest and easiest shot and adjusts the gears accordingly. But I feel more comfortable sticking with the gra consistently because the vast majority of time the art scroll follows the Perishah technique. So the gra changes exactly the opposite. Maslisim pligi al Rab Ach. The following Mishnah that we're going to quote is inconsistent with Rab Ach. Let's just look at the gra in Ois Beis. Maslisim pligi al Rab Ach. And it says in the Brisa, Oisun Hayom, those days, the 9 days that were dedicated as Yomim Tovim, specifically for these families that donated wood when it was most needed. And because of that, they got that privilege from the Nevi'im, that whenever they brought wood, it was their wood that was used. So it's Nohagin b'shas korban v'shaloi b'shas korban. This Yom Tov that they had was not only when the Beis HaMikdash was built, but even post Beis HaMikdash, they still celebrated those days. And those days was Asher B'Tainis and Asher B'Hesped. They were halachas of Yom Tov that applied to these families at those times. Rabbi Yosy Omer, Einin Hagos Ela B'Shas Korban Bilvad. Rabbi Yosy learned that these minhagim, these Yom Tovim, only applied during the Zman Beis HaMikdash. So the way the R scrolls goyers using the nusach of Argamara that were bringing a raya against Rabbi Yosy, it was as follows. And this goes back to what David was saying, that could be the Eitzim as a carbon in and of itself. If there's a Yom Tov established for the fact that they brought wood, it's impossible to say that the purpose of that wood was just to burn other kabbalas, because they would never have established a Yom Tov on bringing a mere accessory to burn a carbon. It must be that the wood itself took on the shape of a carbon itself, and that's why it was made as a Yom Tov, which means we're not making the distinction that the wood is only an accessory. Rather, we're claiming the wood as a carbon itself, and Rabbi Yosy told us earlier that the wood is different, it's considered a machshira carbon. That's how the R scroll learns. But we're going to learn with the shita of the Gra, who were bringing a raya against Rabacha, and the raya isn't even from this. Rather, this same brisa continues on, and that's why the Gra takes out the V'oid min Adah. We also want to bring a raya from a second brisa. The Gra takes it out because this is just a continuation of what we said further, and the raya is one big raya from the whole brisa, and we'll see that in a second. Amr Belezer, Rab Tzadok, Rab Tzadok said, Anu hayinu mibnei Sana ben Binyamin. We were actually members of one of the families, Sana ben Binyamin, who actually had the schus on Tisha B'Av itself to bring the wood. Our Yom Tov was on Tisha B'Av. Now let's not forget, before the Churban Bayis, Tisha B'Av was not yet a fast day. So our Yom Tov was on Tisha B'Av itself. The whole Tisha B'Av lios b'Shabbos, and when Tisha B'Av fell out on Shabbos, v'dachinu oisai l'motzei Shabbos, we pushed off our Yom Tov to Motzei Shabbos. V'hayinu misanin v'loy mashlimin. So on that day, Sunday, which was the day that everybody fasted, on the Nitcha, we weren't mashlim the tainis, because for us it was a day of a Yom Tov where we couldn't fast on that day.
Yosy?
Yes.
Sorry. Is the Yom Tov only for the one family that's bringing, or for all 9 families,
Yes.
even if they're not bringing?
No, it's only for that family. It was a private Yom Tov for those families.
No, but for the one family that brought,
Yes.
or for
Yeah, so
or
each
all
family-
9 families?
No, so the 9 days were not Yom Tovim for all 9 families. Each family had their day.
Okay.
So how do you see a raya from here against Rabacha? So the Taklin provides us a lot more background information as to what happened. So he says it over here. So let's look at the Taklin V'saninu. We fasted on that Nitcha, on that 10th day of Av, but we didn't finish our fast. Ubavli Sham Messiah. The Gemara Bavli there finishes off, adds some more understanding. The reason why we didn't finish the fast on the 10th day of Av, which was a Nitcha to Sunday, was because it was a personal Yom Tov for us. The Hasam Rabbanan Huda Amri Law, the Pligi Arab Yosy. There, if you learn the Gemara, I guess, Takum saying that's the Rabbanan talking. It's the Rabbanan who in our Mishnah makes it very clear that a communal carbon has to always be communal. It cannot be of a Yachid given over to the Tzibur. So this Brisa that talks about this Yom Tov also happens to hold that you cannot give over personal to communal. So on that, Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok, who said this story over, was Beshitas Rabbanan Karmela. He was explaining it according to the Rabbanan, who once again said you cannot take something personal and give it to the communal. The Svirle, he holds, Av Shaloi Bisman Carbon. Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok made it very clear to us that they celebrated this Yom Tov even when the Beis Hamikdash was already Chorv, because he's talking about the fast of Tisha B'Av. If he's discussing the fast of Tisha B'Av, it must be post Beis Hamikdash. According to Rabacha, who holds that the Chachamim hold that you don't make a distinction. There's nothing that you're allowed to transfer from personal to communal. According to Rabacha, this whole story is impossible, because you could have never had such a story where Yechidim provided the eitzim to the Beis Hamikdash to be used communally. The Iulay Mechalak bein Machshirin Lugofishal Carbon. Clearly, Rabacha in our Gemara didn't hold of the distinction that Dovi made, that wood, which is only burning other karbanis, that you could donate according to the Rabbanan of our Mishnah from personal to communal. Rabacha doesn't hold like that. From the Bryce, it's proven that it must have been coming from Yechidim, which is Hechsiku Oisei Yom Tov, the carbon eitzim, the Yechidin Shalem, the Yom Tov. The day that they brought their personal eitzim was treated by them as a Yom Tov. So from the story of Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok, you see quite clearly that we're giving over personal wood and we're giving it over to the community that it should become communal wood. According to Rabacha, this whole story is impossible to have occurred. So the only way this story could have occurred is if you hold of the distinction of Rabbi Yosy, and that is, even though the carbon itself, one would not be able to donate from a personal to become a communal carbon, such as the wheat in our Mishnah, but the wood to burn a carbon, that even the Rabbanan would agree you could give over from personal to communal, and that Svara is inconsistent with Rabacha. Okay, let's see the Heilig Gemara. The article actually lists off the 9 families and who they were, and on which day of the year they had their Yom Tov. But we know that the son of Ben Binyamin, that family, their Yom Tov was on Tisha B'Av itself. Okay, so let's see the Gemara weiter. Ha'omer, let's go back to the Gra and Dalit. So once the Gra says, Min ha'omer u'shtei lechem atamantaninun is nimchak. So he skips out all of this. So we'll just read. I'll stick this in because it's relevant later, but the Gra takes us out up until here. We'll just do the Gra raw. Kol karbanos hayochid yitzibur. All individual karbanos and communal karbanos, boim min haaretz u'min chutz laaretz. You can bring them from, like for instance, your mincha. You can bring it from wheat that grew in Eretz Yisrael, but you can also bring it from wheat that grew in chutz laaretz. Min hachadash u'min hayashin. It could be from fresh wheat, provided that you already brought the carbon omer, or it could be brought from old wheat from last year. The only carbon that's different is chutz min ha'omer u'shtei lechem, the omer u'shtei lechem, which are the first batch of the new crop of wheat and barley, respectively. She'ein bo ela min hachodesh. Of course, they have to come from chodesh because that's the whole point of the carbon, to be makriv, a sample of the new produce of the new crop, and that's matter all the rest of the crop. So it could only be brought from chodesh, u'min haaretz, and also could only be brought from produce of Eretz Yisrael. Chuna b'shem Rabbi Yirmiyah, the Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Chuna, in the name of Rabbi Yirmiyah, said that this halacha is consistent with Rabbi Shmuel. So Rabbi Shmuel Omer, Eina Omer Ba Min Surya, because Rabbi Shmuel also said that you cannot bring the carbon Omer from Surya, which was not Eretz Yisrael proper. It could only be brought from Eretz Yisrael, which is exactly what we just said. She'ein boin ella nechadish umin haaretz. Tamantanin, we looked at the price. As a kedusha say, there's 10 levels of kedusha in land. The Brisa lists off the levels. So one of them is Eretz Yisrael mikudeshes mikol haratzos. Eretz Yisrael is holier than the rest of the lands. Umay kedushasa. What is the distinction that Eretz Yisrael has that makes it more holy than the rest of the lands? It shemavin mimena ha'emer v'avikurim u'shtei lechem. Masha'en mavin kein mikol haratzos. You don't bring any of these karbonis from other lands. So once again, Rabbi Chia said, Rabbi Shmuel, if the fact that the Brisa says that you could only bring the carbon omer from Eretz Yisrael and not Chutz La'aretz, and that distinguishes Eretz Yisrael, it's Rabbi Shmuel omer ein ha'omer ba min Surya. The omer cannot be brought from Surya. And another Brisa to support this. Tamantanina, Rabbi Shmuel omer ma chorish resus of kotzer resus. Now, the halacha is you're allowed to cut the carbon omer down even on Shabbos. So when is the carbon omer brought? The carbon omer is brought on the second day of Yom Tov. What happens if the second day of Yom Tov is a Shabbos? So the first day of Pesach was Friday, and Shabbos was the day of the carbon omer. You cut it the night before. That means you're going to be cutting the carbon omer, the wheat, on Shabbos. Normally, you're not allowed to cut on Shabbos, but we make a drasha from the pasuk. The pasuk says b'chorish uvakotzer tishmos. It's a shaila if it's referring to Shabbos or if it's referring to Shemitah. But there's small ones it's referring to Shabbos. So the Torah is telling you on Shabbos you must not do charisha and you must not do ketzira. And we darshan charisha. Never in the Torah do you find that there's a mitzvah to plow. Plowing is always a volunteer. It's always a volunteer activity. Not really volunteer. It's an optional activity. You could decide to make harisha or not. There's no mitzvah in the Torah that mandates you make harisha. So when the Torah says one may not make harisha on Shabbos, clearly it's not an obligated harisha. It's a harisha that you're doing because you want to do harisha. So the Gemara says, ma harisha rishos, avkatcha rishos, the only type of ketzira that the Torah was referring to when the Torah outlawed ketzira on Shabbos was ketzira that was not a mandatory ketzira. But if you have a ketzira of a mitzvah, for instance, you have to cut down wheat for the carbon omer, that is not covered by the Isser of Shabbos. The Torah is only referring to activities that would otherwise not be a mitzvah. So let's see what the Gra says in A. Yotza ketzira omer. This would remove ketzira omer from the prohibition of Shabbos. Shu mitzvah, because it's a mitzvah to do ketzira omer. Mantana shomer shvichim. Who is the Tana of the following brisa? Shomer shvichos b'shvius. If our Mishnah says the one who watches the wild plants that grow, the wild wheat that grow on Shemitah, so that we can use them for the carbon omer, noitlin schar mitrumas alishka. They get their schar from the trumas alishka. So tomorrow, Rabbi Shmuel, it would only fit in with Rabbi Shmuel, who says that they brought it from Surya. Now, the Taklin teaches us that the same way it allows Ktsira on Shabbos, it would also be allowing Ktsira to be done on Shemitah products. So let's see what he says inside. Ditnan Shmuel Emer ma charish v'uper kama the moed cotton. The Tanakama Dorshlei b'me'inyan inyan l'Shabbos pneu in l'Shvius, the lesser aktsir b'matzai Shvius, but Rabbi Shmuel mater aktsir b'matzai Shvius. Rabbi Shmuel allows you to cut down this wheat the year after Shemitah to use as the Eimer, the Dorsh l'Kra Shabbos, and he learns the Charish of Akotah Tishbois is teaching you that on Shabbos, you're allowed to cut down the wheat for the carbon omer. It must be the osir lahavi misuya. Bishmol must hold that it's osir to take wheat from Surya, from Chutzlarts. The mutter lahavi misuya, if it was mutter to bring wheat from Chutzlarts, lo mehiter lixar b'shviyas. There would be no reason to be matir, cutting down wheat on the Shemitah year for the purpose of bringing the carbon omer, if you could easily avoid the issue of Shviyas by just bringing the wheat from Chutzlarts. So from the fact that Rabbi Shmuel learns from a pasuk a special heter to cut down wheat on the Shemitah, on the post-Shemitah year, which is really already usher, it shows that there was no other alternative like to bring it from Surya. Amar Rabbi Yosy divar kol. But Rabbi Yosy says it would fit in according to everybody, not only according to Rabbi Shmuel, because everybody agrees that lemotzoi b'Surya maybe noisa misvichin sheberetz Yisrael. Sure, you're allowed to bring it from Surya, but what if you couldn't find, for some reason there was a drought and you couldn't find wheat in Surya? You still, as a plan B, would have to rely on the svichin of Eretz Yisrael. So therefore, our Mishnah that says that the pay of the Shomer Svichin came from the Lishka, they might agree that you really could bring from Surya. So why do we have to pay somebody in Eretz Yisrael to watch the Svichin of Shviyas? That's because we need a plan B, just in case we're not able to acquire wheat from Chutzlarts for the carbon omer. We need to make sure that we'll at least have some wheat from Eretz Yisrael. So therefore, Mavino say Mesvichin Yisrael, Hahen Omer, Mahu Hahen. So you should have enough for the carbon omer. Fact Gemara, Mahu sheyizra b'tchil. Now we have a new shayla. Kishe'ain svichin. What if there were no svichin in Eretz Yisrael? We said that if there are svichin that grew on their own, you set up a shomer to watch them. But what if there was no svichin in Eretz Yisrael and it's a Shemitah year? In mutal roya b'shviyas b'Eretz Yisrael, are you allowed to go out specifically to plant when it's also to plant on Shemitah? Because you need to have it for the carbon omer. We know that if there was already existing wheat, you're allowed to cut it down on Shviyas, even though normally you're not allowed to. Could we extend this heter to actually plant if you don't see anything growing? So Reb Chia bar Ada, boy, kumi Rab Mona. Reb Chia bar Ada asked this question in front of Rab Mona, and he brought a raya from, and he said the following time: wouldn't it be like the halacha is the only type of kmitza, a carbon mincha requires a kmitza. So they create this wheat mixture, and the kohen makes a kmitza, takes a small portion of it, and is makshir of it on the mizbeach, and the rest is eaten. Well, what if the rest of it was tamei and it couldn't be eaten? Do you make a kmitza? The halacha is you don't make a kmitza. You only make a kmitza if the kmitza is going to be matir the remaining. But a kmitza that will not be matir the remaining because there's a problem with the remaining, there you wouldn't make the kmitza at all. So here the carbon omer is a carbon mincha, and the kohanim eat the shiore mincha. But since this is from the Shemitah year, the kohanim wouldn't be able to eat it. So what type of carbon would it be if it was planted by Isser? Sure, you could bring the kmitza, but the shiurim of this mincha is leftover Shemitah that wouldn't be able to be eaten. So you shouldn't be able to plant lechatchila for the purposes of the carbon omer. That's what he wanted to argue. So let's see what it says over here in the Taklim. The koimit she'ein matter shiur of lachila, a kmitza that does not matter to shiraim to be eaten, ain't a koimit, that's not a good kmitza. For hachanami yiyu shiraim asurim k'sheyizra b'shviyos. Since the shiraim will be usher to be eaten by the kehanim because it's shemitah of Isser, so too you shouldn't be able to plant for the purposes of the carbon omer because it wouldn't work anyway. So Amalei, Mona answered back, it's not a problem. It would be treated as 5 items that you could bring them betuma even though they can't be eaten. And in these 5 things, the shiraim will not be able to be eaten. Nevertheless, it's still a kosher carbon. Let's see the takum. These are one of the things listed there. These are one of the 5 things that are listed that can be brought betuma. Because like every carbon, it's hutra b'tzibur. So whenever you have a carbon that's hutra b'tzibur, we allow the carbon to be brought, but we don't allow it to be eaten. When the whole carbon omer is tame, even though you have tumor hutra b'tzibur and you're makar of the carbon, nevertheless, it cannot be eaten. Afilu hachi have a omer kosher. Nevertheless, the carbon omer is kosher there. So as the Gemara says, it's still a good shaila. It remains a good shaila. Are you allowed to specifically plant on Shemitah for the purpose of the carbon omer or not? And don't ask me a kasha that the shiraim won't be able to be eaten, because we find other cases as well that even though due to some communal problem the shirim cannot be eaten, it could still be a kosher carbon. So now the question is, when you pay these shomrim, how do you pay them? The problem that we have is hektish cannot be used to pay directly for labor, because the kedusha of the hektish has to be chal on something. Labor
So the Gemara blives the kasha on that, whether or not you can.
According to the Tachlin, the Gemara remains as a shaila, but according to the Alim Meforshim, the Gemara is being pushed to shaila and saying that you for sure would be able to plant on Shemitah
because of too much.
Right. But the Tachlin learns v'shaper mi boilu. The Tachlin says it's still a shaila, and it was just defending the premise of the shaila. So now the question is, how do you pay these shomer? How could you possibly pay them if you cannot just take Hektish's money and give it to a person? So what you do is, you go to a shulchani, to a banker, and you ask him to front the money, to forward chulin money to the karchen, notional karchen, ula shayman. So even before they brought the carbon omer, as soon as they've completed their job, they get money, free and clear chulin money from a shulchani who's laying it out on behalf of Hektish. Then, once they already prepared the carbon omer, and there's a carbon omer that's ready to be brought, so now you have produce here, then you could take money from the lishka, which is Hektish money, and put the kedusha of that money onto the carbon, making it into a communal carbon, and now the money is free and clear, and that money you could now give back to the shulchani who forwarded the money. So here you have a way of always being machal money, the kedusha of the money, onto something else. The Tavoskein, the Tachlin says, could you possibly do that? Is that a smart idea? Are you allowed to do that? The problem is Damino Aimer Yela Charbeli Ibut. The Kiyusoi, if you take the raw wheat kernels and you put the kedusha of the money of Hektish on it, well, a lot of it is going to go to waste, because the entire raw kernel is not brought as the mincha. Rather, it has to be purified and sifted. So much of the kedusha that was placed on this wheat is just going to go into the garbage. Is that appropriate to do? Is kol mashiitin hein damav mishar rishon. You actually look at the value, even though you're doing the transition when the wheat is still in its raw form. But how much money do you give? You give the money that after this wheat is processed and made into flour and it's sifted, so you have much less than what you originally had. You assess the value of that finished product, and that's how much money is discharged from the lishka to redeem it. Only the value of what the finished product is, and that also corresponds to the labor of what these shomer or these kaichim put into it. That's the money that they'll get. So they're not going to get the money of what the value of the entire batch of wheat is. Rather, the money that they're going to get will be equal to the value of the purified sifted flour, which its quantity is less, but its quality is much higher, and that's the amount of money that they got. Tana, came. They were people who worked for the Beis Hamikdash, and they quarried stones for the Beis Hamikdash. Once again, how are they paid for their labor? They took money, chulin money, from a shulchani who forwarded the funds to the laborers. They gave it to those who chopped the stones out of the mountain and those who smoothed it down and prepared it. But it was not there was the mois from hektish was not yet neschal. They actually placed the new stone on the next row in its permanent place. And only then, once the stone was already in place, then maybe mois from Trumas Alishka. They took the money from the Trumas Alishka, and it doesn't mean the money that are used for karbonis. It's just using Trumas Alishka here as a general term. They took Hektish's money, and then they would be mechal the kedusha of the money onto the stone that's already in place. And once again, the Tavas Kain, is it appropriate to do that? Which means on a rough stone that's still going to be planed and perfected. The Gemara of Yosy be'Rabun b'Shem Shmuel is kol mashayitin hein hein deveh misharishon. Once again, the amount of money that is discharged, which means the amount of money that the laborers are paid, is parallel to the value of the final stone, the final product stone. So therefore, Hektish is getting a fair deal. They're getting paid. It's 6:53. We only did Amud Aleph, so we'll have to catch up tomorrow. Okay, shkoich everybody. Have a wonderful, wonderful day.
You too.
Yeah.
Enjoy.
Yeah.
Now get moed.
Bye.
Okay.